After the Civil War, African Americans came very close to becoming slaves again. In fact, in some ways it was worse than before. Sharecropping and convict leasing that replaced slavery were just as bad, and in the case of convict leasing, in some parts of the South, the death rates in the first year were more than 50%. The KKK arose to kill upwards of 4,000 African Americans. This instigated the Great Migration, which was perhaps the only good legacy of the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, you had the fugitive slave law that made it nearly impossible to leave the South. It was still difficult if you lived in a sharecropping family, essentially serfdom. And of course, there was segregation based on the idea that blacks and whites could be separate but equal. Of course, Thurgood Marshall showed that wasn't the case. He showed black schools and black neighborhoods weren't equal. They weren't getting the same funding as white schools and white neighborhoods. So what did the courts decide to do? Well, they ended separation. That is, a black person could now move into a white neighborhood. But they never made the two neighborhoods equal. And then came the drugs, which affected black neighborhoods because they were poor. And then from the drugs came the AIDS epidemic. And, along with the drugs, a heavy and unaccountable police presence. Just as Jim Crow, the KKK, and convict leasing and sharecropping replaced slavery, so did drugs and AIDS replace those ills of society. Was it intentional? Most definitely. It started with Nixon and became honed over the decades. It was realized that overtly racist language couldn't be used anymore, but dog whistles could. This was something even the Nazis realized. They couldn't just yell about Jews all day long. Not everyone was anti-Semitic, and even those that were had other problems. Therefore, I always had a struggle with the argument that the Republican Party is now fascist. It's always been that way, although even Reagan never matched the cult-like status of Trump. Yes, it's worse than it's been in decades, in a century even, but I always need to add that caveat lest anybody have any illusions about conservatives in this country being democracy-loving. They never have been. They were just able to exercise their power more insidiously than in the past. Still, this is the first time they've tried to put a dictator in charge. They didn't even try to do that during the Civil War. In part because the federal government was so weak, they were just able to break away. Now it's an all-or-nothing game. Of course, even if they lose power, they can still wreak havoc. Billionaires funding the various militia groups in this country would be disastrous. Just look at how much death Osama bin Laden caused, and he was a millionaire who lived thousands of miles away. Right now, we're talking about billionaires in our own backyard. It might not turn out that way. We aren't headed for a communist state. If progressives in this country succeed, the best we will get is a government like that of Norway or Canada. Lots of social services, but they still have billionaires in Norway and Canada. If the oligarchs of the former Soviet Union could relinquish power peacefully, so can the plutocrats of our own country. It's always interesting to me when leftists are accused of violence or threatening violence, since if violence ever comes to this country, it will be started by conservatives in a bid to hold on to power. To get back to my main point about the failures of Second Reconstruction, it all revolved around the hidden ways to disenfranchise people of color. Robert Moses, for example, tore through black neighborhoods, apparently saying, they can change laws, but it's much harder to change concrete. A notorious classist and racist, he realized he could destroy black communities by ripping down their histories and putting in overpasses and highways. Urban renewal turned out to be one of the most devastating aspects of Second Reconstruction. Surrounded by the cold and sterile concrete and loud, bustling traffic, it was, of course, a far less hospitable place to grow up. And communities didn't have any input in the destruction of their communities either. Oftentimes, it was public housing, and therefore they had little say in what happened. And this brings me to another problem, which is gentrification. While on the one end, the government was destroying black neighborhoods, so too were private companies, buying up land where black people lived and forcing them to move. And because landlords can refuse somebody who has lived in a low-income neighborhood, the only option for black people was to move to another poor neighborhood. All this constant moving and shuffling makes it very difficult to build up a new community and a new identity. Social organizing becomes next to impossible. It's almost as though they recognized, as much as they liked keeping black people quarantined, it created social networks and safety nets and solidarity. This was very dangerous to white supremacy and therefore had to be disrupted. And moving and overpasses are probably the last thing you want to do as a black person. One of the most frightening things to do as a person of color in America is drive a car. Black people are far more likely to be pulled over and far more likely to be killed, even if they're unarmed. As Malcolm X said, the Klan traded in their robes for police uniforms. It's another reason I like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers so much. They foresaw all of these problems. They recognized ending segregation wasn't enough, although I won't say it was worthless. For those black people who have enough luck or talent to escape the ghetto, they can move to a safer neighborhood. This, of course, doesn't help the rest of the black community. Just as not every black person could escape slavery and not every black person could escape the South during Jim Crow, so not every black person can escape the ghetto. We need to end poverty, and we can do it. After World War II, the American government recognized leaving Germany in poverty was exactly how somebody like Hitler rose to power in the first place. When people are poor and desperate, they do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. They'll turn to crime, or in Germany's case, put in a strongman figure who promises to fix everything. And it was an enormous success. After the Marshall Plan, countries of Western Europe became the most prosperous countries in the world. If we can do that for people in other countries, why can't we do it for our own citizens? I mean, the answer is obvious. Germans are white and black people aren't. That's another good thing about Second Reconstruction, at least, the end of overt racism. They can't ever come out and say it's because they hate black people. So eventually, you catch them because their reasons they give aren't real reasons. The modern day activist must be, to some extent, a detective like Columbo catching racists lying. And that's one thing we can take solace in. We no longer have the burden of proving racism is wrong. We now just have to prove which policies are racist and which politicians are.